Well, hello and welcome to this Global Ecosocialist Network event, a forum on building alliances between Labor and the climate justice movements. My name is Susan Price and I'll be chairing today's discussion. I'm a member of Gen's steering committee and I'm based here in Australia on the Gold Coast. And before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm based on, the Kombumerri people of the Bundjalung Nation, and pay respects to elders past and present. I'm also one of the editors of Green Left, which is a radical media project here. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Central to the struggle to deal with climate change is engagement with and mobilisation around the issue by the global working class. So this forum really brings together Labor activists and climate justice activists from different countries to explore the vital stirrings and mobilisations of the Labor movement in response to climate change, and to really consider what possibilities lie in the struggle for human survival and environmental justice. The struggle that we all face for climate safety is a serious one. As our ocean and surface temperatures continue to rise, we face more extreme weather events, and powerful fossil fuel interests and the governments that serve those interests, particularly in the advanced capitalist countries, are blocking serious action to cut greenhouse gas emissions and blocking climate reparations to the global south. Well, I guess exploring these and other themes, we have a great panel of activists from across the globe who will be joining us today. From South Africa, we have Ferron Pedro, who's a 350africa.org senior campaigner. From the United States, we have Jeremy Brecher from the Labour Network for Sustainability. From Germany, we have Rika Muller-Vahl, a Fridays for Future activist involved in the We Ride Together campaign. And from the Philippines, joining us will be Luke Espiritu, President of Solidarity of Filipino Workers. So our panelists will have 7 minutes to present some opening comments before we move into a Q&A. And for those of us joining on whatever platform you might be viewing this live stream, if you would like to ask our panelists a question, you can simply post that question in the chat in whatever platform you're on, and it will come to us here in the studio. Well, to our speakers. First off, I'd like to introduce Ferron Pedro. Ferron is the senior campaigner, as I said, at 350africa.org, working on the Green New ESCOM campaign, which is being led by the Climate Justice Coalition with 350 Africa. Prior to that, Ferron was the Working Class Campaigns Coordinator and Educator for the Southern African Federation of Trade Unions, where she was responsible for working with progressive working class formations and implementing education programs within SAFTU. Ferron has a master's degree in development studies, with her dissertation focusing on popular education in new social movements, and she has a background as a student and Labor activist. Welcome, Ferron, over to you.
But you've seen me now, but I'll switch off my camera. I hope that's better. Yeah. So I think is a real urgency to this topic, and that's why I'm grateful that you're bringing the movement together. In doing that, we can create a really powerful force for transforming society. So I think that's really important. Don't call it that it's the capitalist economic system that leads to the same exploitation of workers and the environment, and has led us to the crisis that we find ourselves in now. Not the most affected by the changing climate, but also I think have a vital and central role in transforming this in a tangential manner. It's for winning our climate justice demands, and something we about. Taking an honest look at challenges in our context in South Africa can give us insights into what I think are excellent, so bringing close together in the struggle for climate justice. So in preparing of my unionist comrades and asked them, what are challenges? What are the challenges fighting climate?
I'm just going to cut in there. Ferron, your line is really quite bad. It's difficult to hear you, and I think we might have actually lost connection. So I think what we might do is let Ferron reconnect to the chat and perhaps move on to our second speaker and just give Ferron some time. Ferron, you're back with us? Hi, Ferron. Can you hear us okay? Okay. I think the best thing is perhaps if we... Ferron, are you with us? No? Okay, she's muted. All right. I think what we might do is move on to our next speaker and try and bring Ferron back into the discussion when she can find a bit more of a better position for her connection, because she's actually relying on mobile data to join us today. So it's not an easy connection from South Africa where she is at the moment. So what I'd like to do next is to introduce our second speaker, Jeremy Brecher, who's joining us from the United States. Jeremy is a senior strategic advisor and co-founder of the Labour Network for Sustainability. Jeremy is a writer, a historian and activist, and the author of more than a dozen books on labour and social movements. Over the course of half a century, Jeremy has participated and lent his skills to movements for civil rights, nuclear disarmament, peace, international labour rights, global economic justice, accountability for war crimes, climate protection, and many other important issues. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Jeremy. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great. Thanks so much. And it's great to be with a group of people who are struggling with these same issues and these same problems. Is my sound okay? Can you hear me okay?
Okay. Yes, loud and clear. Loud and clear.
Okay. So I work in the United States context, which means it's a somewhat different situation vis-a-vis labor and climate than many other countries. The American labor movement is surely one of the most backward when it comes to addressing the issues of climate, and most likely to be advocating for climate policies and approaches that are either denying the climate crisis or more likely solutions that are extremely unlikely to address it effectively. So far from being any kind of leader in addressing these questions, we're really the laggards and eager to learn from others. I work with an organization called the Labor Network for Sustainability, whose slogan is making a living on a living planet, and there are no jobs on a dead planet. And we work every day trying to encourage organized labor and help organized labor find a way to be more involved and more positively involved with climate issues, and to help the climate and environmental movements have a better understanding of working people and organized labor. The main issue that we face and the main frame that is applied to the relation between labor and climate protection in the United States is what we call the jobs versus environment frame. And the issue is constantly portrayed whenever proposals are made for serious climate protection. Oh, that's going to cost workers their jobs. That's going to undermine the employment prospects for American workers. And that's in the media, and it's in the labor movement itself. And of course, it's constantly propounded by the PR machine of the fossil fuel industry. Labor Network for Sustainability is constantly fighting for another frame, which is, first of all, that climate change itself is the real job killer, and that jobs fixing the climate are the best plan for worker employment and for social justice. So let me go very fast over 5 strategies that we use for trying to shift the labor movement from this climate versus jobs frame to an alternative frame. The first one is pretty obvious, which is to recognize the common interest in human survival and in sustainable livelihoods for working people and the rest of humanity. There are not 2 groups of people, climate advocates or environmentalists and workers. We all need a livelihood, and we all need a livable planet to live on. If we don't address both, we'll starve together while we're waiting to fry. The second theme or strategy is to look for alliances around specific issues. So, for example, here, and I think in many other countries too, workers in transportation industry have joined with environmentalists to advocate for shifting from private cars to public transit. That would create large numbers of skilled jobs and greatly reduce greenhouse gas and local pollution. And so we're actually able to build, in spite of the overall labor movement's concern from about will these changes undermine jobs in the transit industry. There's strong worker and union support for climate protection. A third approach is to seek win-win solutions to conflicts. So we're constantly facing situations where unions, both on their own initiative and through employer connivance, are being mobilized to oppose climate protection measures. And so people who are advocating for climate protection need to make concrete plans for just transition in cooperation with unions. I've been doing some research on examples of this, and for example, there was a coal-fired power plant that was closed in Massachusetts, where the unions worked with the local climate activists to and the local community too, to turn it into a clean energy hub, which is now producing more jobs than the power plant that was closed. My organization, Labor Network for Sustainability, during the great struggle over the Keystone XL pipeline, developed a plan that showed how you could create jobs for pipe workers and others along the route of the KXL pipeline, but there would be jobs that would be protecting the climate rather than destroying it. Fourth point is to support a broad public agenda for creating full employment by converting to a climate-safe economy. In the context of the United States, that really means the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal plan and proposal is really what in this country defines the idea of climate protection as a means for creating good jobs and social justice. And finally, we can start building the Green New Deal, or whatever the equivalent is in other places, right now from below. And as a matter of fact, I'm just finishing a book called The Green New Deal from Below, which looks at the way that community groups, unions, cities, states, and others in civil society are creating a Green New Deal from below. The book has scores and scores of examples. I'm not going to try to summarize them now, but just to take one example, a labor coalition in the Boston suburb of Somerville, Massachusetts, has created its own Green New Deal in cooperation with the environmental and climate movements and with local immigrant movements and community and neighborhood movements, where they have made their own plan for good jobs and social justice through jobs protecting the climate. They've persuaded the city to invest in climate jobs, and now they're using money from federal programs to feed into their local and locally developed project plans and to fund their development. The book will be out in a while, not immediately, but the title is The Green New Deal from Below. It'll be published by Illinois University Press. So just to wrap up, these elements are building blocks not only for a national Green New Deal, but also potentially the building blocks for what we need ultimately, which is, whatever terms you want to use, as we use here, a global Green New Deal. Great to be with you, and carry on with the struggle.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. Great to hear from you, and I'm sure we'll be able to explore some of those examples that you raised further in the discussion. Now, I'd just like to also welcome Luke Espiritu into the panel. He's arrived while Jeremy was speaking. So Luke will be our final speaker on the panel today. But we're just going to return to Ferron because she was having trouble with the hotspot she was using, and we'll make the most of her much better quality connection now to hear her presentation. So thanks, Ferron. Please take it.
Thank you, and thank you so much for your patience. I am very happy to be here, and I hope you can hear me much better now. I'll be looking in the chat to see if I get frozen again. And thank you for the previous speaker. I'm very interested to hear, to read that book, The Green New Deal from the Bottom Up. Great, good connection. I'm getting that chat from Susan. Okay, so I think there is really a real urgency to this topic in bringing labor and climate movements more closely together. It's something that I've recognized and we've recognized as central in our South African campaigning strategy at 350 Africa. So I think there's both the recognizing it as a challenge, but also that there's this amazing, powerful force potential force for transforming society in linking labor movements and climate movements more closely. I think it's quite clear to everybody, even those who don't consider themselves revolutionary socialists, that it's capitalism and our current economic systems that
has been built on the exploitation of both workers and the environment that has led us to the current emergency, climate emergency, and various, in South African context, various other emergencies. We have an unemployment crisis, we have an energy crisis, which I know extends beyond our borders, but these emergencies are and these crises are clearly rooted in capitalist modes of production. So the working class in and outside of the trade movement are not only the most affected by the changing climate, but also have a vital role to play in overcoming its impacts and transforming society. So for me, this is not a tangential matter. It's central in my work and in I think the strategies for climate movements in South Africa that I've been part of. And I think by taking an honest look at the challenges being faced by the labor and climate movements in our context, that can give us some really good insights into what we need to do and what opportunities exist to strengthen these movements, not just internally, which is needed, but also to bring them closer together and to make real gains in the struggle for climate justice. So in preparation for this, I spoke to a few of my comrades in the union movement and asked them, what do you think are some of the challenges? Why is it that the climate and labor movement sometimes are at odds, and even when that's not the case, are not working as closely and powerfully together as possible? So my comrade Newton in a union called Thorn, which is a transport, I forgot what it stands for, sorry, but it's in the retail, transport and retail union, yeah. So they say, so he says, in Thorn, we organize mostly precarious workers concerned about the immediate issues, permanent jobs and wages. Many are single mothers that just don't have the time and mental energy to be concerned about anything more than survival. More secure workers are quite articulate on this issue. Workers in NUMSA and NUM, that's the metal workers and mine workers unions, are quite articulate and interested in the energy crisis in particular. But if we want to bring in the majority of workers, we have to weave their immediate issues with the issues of the climate. And I think that's a long-standing recognition in climate justice movements. Abida from the Union Giusa, which we've just recently joined at 350, so I'm a Giusa shop steward, the General Workers Union, said that trade unions are struggling to operate with their own internal shortcomings, factional battles, limited resources, a changing workforce, an inability to attract young people to the trade union movement in the context of 40% unemployment with no end in sight. There's a perception that the climate justice movement is driven by the interests of the middle class and the privileged. The way, the tone that they speak to workers, we know what is good for you and you must trust us on this and you must just do what we say. There's a sense that they're speaking down to workers and the working class, and even when workers don't object, they vote with their feet, their lack of interest and their lack of participation in campaigns and movements. Campaigns come fully packaged and workers don't participate in creating these campaigns. Workers aren't accommodated with meetings and educational programs happening during working hours, for example. Workers' issues should be taken up even if there isn't a direct link to the climate movement, to help prevent the feelings workers have that you want our support, but only for your campaigns and your agendas. The feeling of being used to push up the numbers. Comrade Vusi from NUMSA, regional organizer in NUMSA, said there's a metal workers union, the biggest one, says unions are not talking enough about climate issues on the shop floor. Those most affected by the transition are deeply fearful of job losses and very suspicious of how renewable energy is being introduced. Privately owned, independent power producers will mean exorbitant prices. He also says he organizes mines in Mpumalanga, which is a province in South Africa, which is the sort of coal mining sector heartland. And he says, and the coal mining sector is booming. If the West is imposing a climate agenda, then why are they importing our coal? So information is not communicated enough, and there are different points of views inside of the labor movement. And then lastly, Comrade Trevor from SAFTU, he's the SAFTU spokesperson where I used to work. He says, the main fears workers have is around job preservation, decommissioning of power plants in the coal value chain, job losses in 2 minutes ago. Okay, I won't go into the whole quote, but he says that there's a sense that the climate movement is led by NGOs who have agendas funded by corporations and institutions led by the industrialized Western countries such as the IMF or OECD, advocating for policies which are contrary for the developmental needs of the global South. So this task has also led to a kind of climate denialism, with the climate emergency seen as a Trojan horse for resource extraction. So I've seen in recent reports and comments by prominent union leaders arguing that moving away from coal will harm the country's economy, electrification efforts, and increase electricity tariffs. So if climate activists want workers to come on board and organize labor to come on board more actively in their campaigns, they have to be steeped in, this is from Trevor, they have to be steeped in a radical social justice ethos, taking seriously demands for reskilling and job creation, and have cogent plans on how affected communities will remain resilient. And so I think these quotes give us some sense of the opportunities to bring the movements closer together. The one thing is that we need to be insiders in supporting the trade union movement, at least in the African context. And I think this probably speaks more broadly beyond our context, that we need to support the rejuvenization of the trade union movement. And for me, that the first thing was we need to join a movement. We need to join a union as 350 Africa. So we joined a union, and there's a lot that can be done in what we call sort of movement generosity, supporting shop stewards training, workers' popular education, education at workplaces. And linking with campaigns in solidarity as insiders in the trade union movement. We've also actively focused on solutions and the job-creating power of decarbonization, with the jobs crisis in South Africa, and the fact that the term just transition has been co-opted by entities that don't have a lot of concern for workers or the environment, really. We have to work hard to win back that term or use new ones, and that means collective and collaborative action in coming up with these new ideas, or building on the ones we've got and taking them back. And so building a Labour Climate Alliance requires this multi-issue, broad-based coalitions, and we have such a coalition. The Climate Justice Coalition in South Africa includes trade unions, community formations, and NGOs. And a big focus of our work inside of the coalition is popular education in communities, learning lessons from each other. Whenever we have any kind of action or activity or education program, it's important for us to include trade unions, community organizations, and youth groups. This also means aggressively extending the case for public ownership to renewable energy, with incredible distrust around the corporatization and privatization of energy in South Africa. So sorry, I'm winding up, please, but I think that these is incredible opportunities, and thank you for letting me make this contribution.
Thank you so much, Ferron, and that was a really good quality connection, so it was fantastic to be able to hear your presentation in full. It would have been such a shame not to have done that, so thanks again. Okay, I will move on to our third speaker now. I'd like to welcome Rika Muller-Vahl, who's joining the panel from Germany. Rika is a Fridays for Future activist living in Berlin and is active in the campaign called We Ride Together. I won't try and pronounce it in German, but that campaign brings together climate activists and workers in the public transport sector in a common fight for mobility, a mobility transition. And I just wanted to mention that it was actually an article about that very campaign and the strike for climate that happened in March in Germany that was one of the sparks that led to Jen actually holding this event. So we appreciate the work that comrades are doing in Germany around this, and it'll be great to hear from Rika more about this campaign. So over to you. Thanks.
Yes, thanks a lot, Susan, for the introduction. I brought some photos with me that I'll just try and share. All right, thanks. Yes, hello again. My name is Rika. I live in Berlin and I'm active in Fridays for Future, and the Wir fahren zusammen, it is called in German, and it would be We Ride Together in English, that I would like to introduce to you today. And as Susan mentioned, We Ride Together is about building a joint strike movement between activists from the climate justice movement and workers in public transport companies all over Germany. And we as activists are convinced, in order to seriously fight for a climate just future, there needs to be a majority in society that stands up for this and that has the means to be able to attack the power of, for example, the big fossil energy companies and fossil capital. And in our eyes, this requires climate politicization, a climate turn of the trade unions, and at the same time an orientation of the climate justice movement towards the workers, a labor turn. And we believe that the campaign We Ride Together is an important step along the way. But thinking from the beginning, what is the campaign We Ride Together? In 2024, collective bargaining will take place in local public transport companies across Germany, and about 100,000 employees from 160 companies will very likely go on strike to improve their working conditions. Because the current working conditions in public transport companies are catastrophic. Long driving times, stress, split services, no toilet breaks are everyday life. And politically, far too little is invested in public transport, its expansion and personnel. And as a result, many drivers are leaving the jobs and there are far too few new recruits. And at the same time, it is clear that more drivers are needed in public transport companies to make climate-friendly change in transportation at all possible. And this constellation makes 2024 a very favorable time window for this alliance, because the trade union in the local transport sector, it's called Verdi, is ready to lead an offensive and climate political collective bargaining dispute due to the lack of personnel, the desolate working conditions, and the social relevance of the public transport sector. And at the same time, many activists in the climate justice movement, like myself, are frustrated by years of experience of defeat and are looking for new means of power and open to closing ranks with those fighting for an upgrade of the climate jobs of the future. And on this basis, activists have made contact with workers in local public transport companies in around 40 cities since last October. And in some cities, we were helped by the fact that local transport companies had already gone on strike at the beginning of the year. That was what this article was about. Within this framework, on March 3rd, 2023, there was a special kind of strike day in about 40 cities across Germany. Verdi, the union, scheduled its Germany-wide strike in public transport on the same day as the Fridays for Future Global Climate Strike Day. And this joint strike day made a huge impression with the striking workers, who were often on a climate strike for the first time, with the striking activists, who were often at a workers' strike for the first time, who on the strike day, together as workers and activists, could experience the feeling of collective and joint action of this kind for the first time. And in terms of the media, it's also blatantly gone through the roof. And also with the employers, the chief executive of the Confederation of German Employers publicly denounced the joint strikes as a dangerous crossing of the line into a political strike. But the joint strike day did not come about on its own, however, but was the result of weeks and months of building trust between workers and activists. For example, in Göttingen, a small town in Lower Saxony, an exceptionally close cooperation has already developed over the past months. When the activists in Göttingen first contacted the workers in October, though, the first reaction was skepticism, because the blockade actions of the last generation here in Germany, or even the current political measures such as an unsocial heating reform, mean that the climate justice movement and the climate issue in general do not have a very good reputation among many workers. They said things like, "We don't want to cooperate with those who glue themselves on the road," or "Those are the tunes blocking my bus ride." And that's what we heard quite often when we got in contact with the workers for the first time. So it was not an easy situation to start from, despite seemingly close interests. But the activists, for example, in Göttingen or in other cities, and this is decisive, did not let up, but started a conversation with the workers. They said, we want to support you in your collective bargaining round because we think that good working conditions in the transport companies are necessary for a change in transport. We are serious. We believe that climate justice can only go hand in hand with good working conditions for you in the companies. And in Göttingen, that's what you see, Göttingen are the activists you see on this picture, who they organized a town hall meeting in solidarity with the strikes, and 200 people came from Göttingen to hear from the workers what working conditions in public transport are like. Or in Cologne, there was initially an unanimous vote of the union activists against cooperation with the climate justice movement. And the activists then went through Cologne for 2 weeks and collected over 1,000 signatures in solidarity with the workers' strike, thus winning their trust. And in Göttingen, again, you see this on the picture, the activists did a survey on the willingness to strike with the majority of the workers by standing at the depot every day for a week, sometimes starting at 4 a.m. and holding talks and getting in touch and earning trust. And in these cities, like many others, they then stood together on the streets to strike as a finale on March the 3rd, often also starting at 3 a.m. You see this from Hanover, often starting at 3 a.m., where the activists helped set up the picket lines. At the same time, it is clear that March the 3rd was only the starting point. The major nationwide strikes in public transport will follow, as I said, in early 2024. And in the coming weeks, we want to build up the activists groups of We Ride Together in the individual cities and further develop the relationship of trust with the workers in the transport companies. And then starting in fall this year, this will be followed by a double majority petition. We will simultaneously collect signatures in the company and in society for the implementation of the company demands and for massive political investments in the public transport. And those will also be the issues that we will then take to the streets together in large numbers. And then hopefully 100,000 drivers and 100,000 activists will go on strike together in the spring of 2024. And yes, take a big step towards a turnaround in transportation and show that like a climate turn in the unions and a labor turn in the climate justice movement is possible.
Thanks so much, Rika. Okay, well, we're going to hear from our fourth and final speaker now. I'd like to very much welcome Luke Espiritu to this panel. Luke is the president of the, Luke's from the Philippines. He's the president of the Militant Labour Centre, which is called Solidarity of Filipino Workers, or BMP. Luke's also a former National Committee member of the Party of the Labouring Masses, or PLM, and was one of PLM's senatorial candidates in the 2022 national elections in the Philippines. So thanks again, Luke, and welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you for the introduction. Now, I would like to start with something that we experienced here in the Philippines in regard to a transition to cleaner energy in the transport sector, concrete experience. But I just would like to point out that in this experience, it is pretty much clear that the fight for just transition is not about losing jobs. It is about preserving jobs. And during the transport strike that we had in March of this year, that became very clear. Because in the context wherein transition is inevitable, That means everyone knows and everyone understands. The world, the entire world, even the property owners, even the capitalists, we understand that we need to have transition, and they do. And if we leave the task of transition to them, they will do so in such terms that are beneficial to the property owners, to the capitalist class. If we leave the question of changing from fossil fuel to clean energy to them, they will only do that when they benefit from the transition. And that's what we have experienced in the Philippines, because the Philippine government early this year has announced that it will phase out our traditional transport, which is the jeepney, because according to the government, it emits more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we have to transition from that type of a vehicle to what they call a Euro 4 engine modern jeepney. But they are doing so in order to remove the transport sector from the hands of the small transport operator, and with the livelihoods of transport workers being at risk, and give the entire transport industry to corporate interests, who will now control the transport sector and create profit or surplus from a monopoly of the transport industry. And that was the attempt of the government early this year. And it became very, very clear to the transport workers that in this case, uh, true, there is an attempted transition, purportedly from a obsolete type of transport vehicle towards a more environmental friendly type of transportation, but in the terms of the property owner, in the terms of capitalist interest, which will result in the loss of thousands of jobs. And this resulted in a big transport strike in our country for the preservation of jobs. And in this case, it became very clear that yes, we do want a transition. And in fact, transition is inevitable. But the transition must be just. It must not be defined by the capitalist class as to what kind of transition. It must be defined by those who are affected by the transition. And we demanded that those who are affected, the transport workers, must be heard on the process of transition, and it must ensure the continuation of livelihoods. So in this case, I don't see that the interest of the labor movement and climate justice would be at odds in the context of an inevitable transition. It is but more beneficial to the labor movement that the labor movement defines the transition. Let the workers control the terms of the transition, that it must be done with justice. And in fact, the labor movement must push for cleaner energy, and in fact, make it quicker under their terms. And this is the intersection that I see. This is the intersection that I see in regard to uniting the labor movement with the movement for climate justice. In the Philippines, climate justice is still being advanced by civil society groups and NGOs. And we are still starting that the major labor organizations and labor groups will get to um, embrace the fight for climate justice under the context of a just transition. And in fact, we have alliances, labor groups, we have alliances with major non-governmental organizations that push for climate justice. Like, for example, my organization, the Bukluran ng Manggagawang Pilipino, does have a partnership with the Philippine Movement for Climate Justice, the Center for Energy, Ecology, and Development, and the Asian People's Movement for Debt and Development, which are organizations that have embraced and advanced the fight for climate justice, and BMP is very much a part of these labor groups. And in the future, in fact, I could see the prospects for the labor movement in the Philippines to uh, embrace fully this fight for climate justice. And I would just like to add that the labor movement in the Philippines has been there and has been pushing for a system that is an alternative to capitalism, has been pushing for the socialist alternative. In the 100-year struggle of the labor movement in the Philippines, it has acted towards this alternative, and it is but consistent with pushing for an alternative system to capitalism that the labor movement will embrace as part of the fight for socialism, will embrace climate justice, because ultimately the kind of transition that is really needed will definitely affect the kind of system that we have. You cannot just tweet a simple policy of the government, or a simple, or a part of the system that we have right now, like, for example, the energy sector. You cannot just change it without opening the floodgates to several other developments, which will ultimately put into question the kind of system that destroys the environment, and that is capitalism. And the historical struggle of the Filipino labor movement for socialism should definitely be would definitely be something that is consistent with the fight for climate justice. Thank you very much. That would be all.
Thanks so much, Luke. And thanks to all of our panelists for some very thought-provoking presentations. So we're going to move now into the Q&A part of this event. So as you've been seeing on the bottom of your screen, if you'd like to ask a question of the panel, please post your question in the comments or chat on whatever platform you're joining us through, and it will appear here for our speakers to answer. But just while everyone's having a bit of a think about what they'd like to ask, I've got two questions that I'd like to pose to the panelists. I guess the first of these is the ultimate question, and that's, how do we win? How do we win a safe climate, an eco-socialist future, a Green New Deal from below? However, I guess we want to conceive of that win when we're up against, the biggest, most profitable corporations in the world. And I guess specifically, what can we learn from some of the recent victories that we may have experienced, but also the losses that will help us in our next campaigns? And I know that already one of our audience members has particularly asked if Jeremy could expand a bit more on the experiences in Boston, but perhaps, there may be other examples there. And I guess the other question is, what is the unique contribution that eco-socialists can make and should make to building, this powerful movement that we know we all need to win a safe climate, to win a just transition, whether, that's about understanding the nature of the problem, identifying solutions, or discussing strategy. So I guess there are a couple of points to get our panel activated around, just while we wait to hear from our audience. So we've got some questions coming in, but I might just throw back to Ferron, and if you'd like to make some comments in response to those 2 points, Ferron.
Thanks, Susan, and thank you to all the other panelists. It's been really interesting to listen to you and what's happening in different contexts. I think just in the South African context, one of the, I'd say it's where we're stepping back, is that we've seen, or a challenge is that we've seen an increased, because of the local context around Eskom, our public utility, and load shedding and the energy crisis here, we've seen an increased sort of public appetite for privatization and privatization of our public utility, and we've really had to push up and show, sort of amplify and show the primacy of public ownership and democratic control of energy systems in our climate justice work, to bring in, progressive forces, trade union movements, and so on, because there's a real skepticism and some legitimate fears around the way in which renewable energy is being procured, and who's ultimately going to be owning and benefiting from energy production in South Africa. And so one big aspect of the Green New Eskom campaign is a demand for social ownership, community ownership, public ownership. And I think we do need more examples of that, particularly examples in the global south, because it's easy to see like cooperatives and in Europe and in contexts, in American contexts, where the communities come together with some kind of capital. So we can see examples of public ownership and democratic control and social ownership, and part of what we're trying to do in the Climate Justice Coalition and various other social movements, Abahlali Bashimjundolo and Groundworks and some other NGOs have been working on a pilot project in KwaZulu-Natal that's been really hard hit by floods. In Limpopo, we're currently starting a project with the Sekune combined mining affected community to get Anglo-American to fund a project that would be part of their social labor plan, which would be owned by the Sekune community themselves. So these are the kinds of examples which I think we could win the back sort of public, because public trust in state ownership and public ownership, and we have a lot of work to do to undo the sort of cynicism that's risen in and distrust that's risen in state ownership because of corruption and graft and inefficiency and the lack of investment and austerity, which has resulted in the crisis we find ourselves in. So that's one of the things that we are looking to do.
Thanks, Ferron. Jeremy, would you like to make some comment?
Unfortunately, I don't have any magic bullets to address the how do we win question. I think we have to learn as we go along, experiment, and try different kinds of actions, build broader coalitions. But I would suggest the idea of a pincers movement. I think on the one hand, we need to have concrete models that people can look at that are actually being implemented at a local and provincial or state level, where people can see that far from being a job killer, far from being a way to adversely affect the positions of working people and people of color, discriminated against people, that there can be concrete programs for climate protection that are also means for creating jobs, protecting workers, and advancing discriminated against communities, which is what I'm trying to do in the Green New Deal from Below book. And those chapters are being published serially on the website of the Labor Network for Sustainability. So if anyone wants to rush ahead and not wait for the book, go to just Google Labor Network for Sustainability. The series of commentaries that describe the Green New Deal research are in a series called, if you go /strike exclamation point. So if you don't want to wait for the book, take a look there. The other part of the pincers movement is very much, in my mind, we have to have a truly global movement, that as long as we have basically movements that are confined within the parameters of national politics, they will be co-opted and played against each other. We see an extreme example of that now with US-China rivalry, where the production of solar panels and other technologies for climate protection have become pawns of international and inter-imperialist rivalry and preparations for World War III, all in the name of climate protection. So we have to formulate an independent view, standpoint for what I call a global climate insurgency that presents an alternative that is viable in country after country as an alternative, but as part of a global movement. And for that reason, I think that this forum and concerns that are being expressed by the people who organized it are a very important part of the climate protection struggle, as well as the working class struggle.
Thanks, Jeremy. Rika, over to you.
Yes, I think the first question is one of the very most important and probably also most difficult questions, because I think in the future we will have like very, very hard fights to come. I mean, it's about the survival of humanity, and have to seriously ask ourselves, how do we win those battles? And I think as eco-socialists, it's pretty clear for a lot of us that in the end we need a majority with like worker strike power that can stop capitalist production. And at the moment, I think we are very far from that. And the question is, how do we get there? And I think one important point, and that's why I think the We Ride Together campaign can be a very important step on the way, is that we have to win reform battles in the here and now, where we learn and model how to win the bigger battles of the future. First, in face of the climate crisis, I think winning a reform battle in the here and now means preserving room to maneuver for battles to come. Like when we talk about socially and ecological just distribution of resources, this means linking production and investment decisions back to social needs. And this means we have to fight battles for the upgrading of the public sector, and whether a transport turnaround can be achieved in the future and emissions can be reduced in a relevant way as a result really depends on what investments in public transport looks like today, and whether the working conditions of workers improve. And at the same time, of course, it is not just a matter of winning reform battles, because I think we need to identify projects where we as activists and workers can model and learn what it means to win and how to do it when we join forces. And I think We Ride Together means the possibility for the workers and trade union movement to learn how to fight for better working conditions. And at the same time, it also means the opportunity to learn how to use their power resources as worker movements for larger climate political purposes, like this climate turn of the workers' movement that I talked about. And I also think it's very important that in the We Ride Together campaign, this means beginning to unravel the systematic split that at the moment we face between the climate justice movement and the workers' movement, because at the moment, because of this split that I mentioned, it's very hard to get in contact with the workers between the climate movement and the climate topic as a whole are seen very skeptical. That in the end means that at the moment workers do not use their powers that they inherit to fight for like a climate just future. And I think that like We Ride Together means to learn exactly like that, to use the powers, the workers' powers, or the powers relevant to fight for climate policy demands. And yeah, like just a short comment on the second question. I think like that's in the end our role as eco-socialists in this We Ride Together campaign, to like identify a window of opportunity to analyze our own power resources, like having in mind that the workers' power in the end is the one that will decide if we can actually win or lose, and also the power resources on the other side, and thus make a fight possible in which we can show what left-wing climate policy looks like, in which we can actually win together, because I think that's a feeling that climate activists and also workers are not really often experiencing. And with that, we can also reach out to other sectors, other workers, people in other countries, where cooperative between the climate justice movement and workers seems to be even more difficult than in the public transport sector. But I think we need to start with campaigns like this to then be able to go on to the more difficult sectors.
Thanks, Rika. Luke, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think we have to reaffirm the two stages of the struggle. That there's a democratic stage of the struggle wherein we fight for concrete reforms within the very same system. The furthest extent that we could obtain from the system that we have right now, we must achieve those concrete gains. And the fight for a different type of system, which is socialism, will come from that. And I'm emphasizing this because when we talk about the democratic struggle and the socialist struggle, we must not forget a certain goal in mind. And victory must be defined if we achieve this goal. And we must always be reminded that it is about the class, the oppressed classes, gaining political power. We could not entrust that our environmental future will be defined under the same ruling class that has destroyed the environment. Ultimately, if we have to talk about winning, we have to talk about capture of political power, capture of the government, and using the instrument of the government or the state, being able to implement the type of policies or laws or the type of direction that are necessary in order for us to protect our environment. So that's the key to us in answering how do we win. The key is we must remind ourselves that we cannot evade the question of the capture of political power.
Thank you, Luke. Now, we've had a few questions posted in on the chat, some of which were partly, I think, answered in that last round of comments, but I think there was a question there around global connections. Paul LeBlanc was asking, are there stirrings to build ties and strategic global coordination between the movements in various countries? Obviously, workers of all countries need to cooperate in this effort. And then Jess, who asked a question for Rika, Germany has a big car industry. Does the We Ride Together campaign have any connections with car factory workers? So perhaps, Rika, you might like to answer perhaps that question first, and then if anyone from the panel would like to comment in response to Paul's question around global connections, you can do that. So Rika, did you want to respond first?
Yes. At the moment, we don't really have close ties to the workers in the automobile sectors. And I think this for different reasons. The automobile sector in Germany is quite huge, and there are also fights, like union fights going on about the transformation of the automotive sector, but it's much harder to get in contact with the workers there. Because obviously their jobs depend on the mode of production at the moment, and like also the media and so on. This what Jeremy has called jobs versus climate problem is much more present in that department. And that also leads to the problem that in the automotive industry, when it comes to like transformation or fights for transforming the industry, there are most of the times defensive confrontations. Like it's about not losing the job and trying to prevent closures of the factories at some points, and that is around those topics. It's much harder to go on an offensive cooperation. But also I think it will be important in the future to get in contact with the automotive workers, but I think it will help to first have an example of how climate justice movement and workers in general can work together, and then go on and reach out to those.
And on the topic of global connections, did you want to make any comment around that, Rika?
Yes, I can. I mean, I'm in the Zoom call to today, so I think I think global connection and learning from each other in our fights is and can be very helpful. And I have been in contact with, for example, activists from Austria or from Portugal or from other countries where campaigns like at some point similar to our campaign have started in the prior months. And at the same time, I think the prerequisites under those the union fights and our joint struggles happen in the different countries are quite different. Like when I talked to the people in Austria, they told me that in the transport sector they hadn't had big strikes at all in the last years. They had one bigger strike last year, and that got lost, and that sometimes makes this transfer of what we do, like for example in Germany to other countries quite hard because the prerequisites are so different. But at the same time, I think in general, our tactics, our strategies, and so on, there's a lot of stuff that we can learn from each other. Like, for example, we also, as activists in this We Ride Together campaign, use methods from organizing or out of organizing, union organizing, that we learn from the American union activists, Jane McAlevey, and a lot of us have profited a lot of those examples on how to really build up majority movements. And yeah, I think for this, this global connection can be very helpful.
Thanks, Rika. Ferron, would you like to comment on this question of global connections?
Yeah, this is becoming increasingly relevant in our context. Well, I mean, of course, we're going to need international solidarity and international organizing to have any chance of confronting a capitalist class that is organized beyond national borders. But in the South African context in particular, because we're dealing with a narrative which I think is a false narrative, which people have been speaking about around well, it's not really a false narrative. There are genuine concerns around green imperialism and perpetuating neo-colonial relations with countries with, structural adjustment programs or green structural adjustment programs that people are very concerned about, and those are that's totally legitimate. But where I think the false dichotomy comes in is that's representative of a climate justice program, and that an alternative, that fossil fuels are more fossil fuel imperialism, which is like the original imperial, or not, yeah, in South Africa, very certainly a part of our colonial history, that's sort of more linked to the to our development and the benefits for workers. So that's sort of the false dichotomy. And so what I've been thinking about and trying to work with my colleagues in other regional teams in Africa is a Pan-African response to that kind of narrative. And already during Africa Month, so the 25th of May is Africa Day. So in Africa Month, we've been connecting our groups that we organize and climate activists so that we can come up with a new narrative that speaks about how we can the climate justice movement as a new form of liberation struggle, liberating us from fossil fuel imperialism and coming up with solutions that are embedded in our African context. So that's one, not the full global solidarity or connections, but I think a good start, and I think speaks directly to some of the more immediate problems we're having right now in building our movement. But I think, yeah, somebody mentioned in the chat about the trade unions for energy democracy grouping, and I know lots of unions in South Africa, and SAFTU is part of that grouping and is definitely engaging with unions, talking about how can we push for a public pathway to a just transition that's steeped in, democratic control and energy as a public good rather than a commodity. But of course, there's just so much more work to do. And this is a good start. I'm already thinking, Rika, of who I can connect you with in South Africa, who can be. So this is already a good start, and learning from the comrades here is definitely helpful for me. Yeah, thanks.
That's great. Okay, I might jump to Luke now. Actually, perhaps you'd like to also comment on this question of global connections, but I know there was also a question from one of the audience members about the transport workers' strike that you mentioned in the jeepney sector, and was there a resolution or a result from that? So perhaps you'd like to address that as well.
Okay, global connections, it is through our partnerships with civil society organizations, namely the non-government organizations that my own labor organization is connected with, the Center for Energy, Ecology, and Development, the Asian People's Movement for Debt and Development, and the Philippine Movement for Climate Justice. They have international links, sending delegations always to the Conference of Parties, um, attending international forums. In fact, I'll be sent to some of this in this year. So those would be in pursuit of global linkages. But of course, there's a lot of uh, improvement that can be made, especially to create a real, movement with labor solidarity, labor groups worldwide, internationally standing for climate justice. That still needs to be done. Now, in regard to the transport strike, there is a bit of a truce. The government has stepped back on its deadline, pushed back its deadline for, I think, December of this year. So there's no clarity yet as to whether the so-called jeepney modernization will be push through, or they will hear the viewpoints of the affected transport workers. So far, there's just been a pushback of the deadline. So that means there will still be confrontation. The final confrontation has been delayed for a time, but there will be still confrontation, and I'm not even surprised if it will result again into another transport strike until the government will accept that the transition must be just and it must not be dictated upon and controlled by the businessmen who simply want to take over the entire transport industry and take them away from the small operator, and resulting in the destruction of millions of livelihoods of the transport workers.
Thanks, Luke. Jeremy, over to you. There was also a question in regard to agricultural workers, which I'm sorry I didn't catch before our other panelists were speaking. But Jeremy, if you could address the question of global connections, if you've got any comment on this issue of efforts being made amongst agricultural workers or campesinos, if you've got any thoughts to share on that, please do. Thanks.
I'm probably not the person to comment on agricultural workers. I'm all ears to hear what others may have to say. And I spoke a little bit before about the global dimensions here. I think we can certainly say that they are woefully lacking and need to be very much developed. That's why I said that I thought this forum was a useful contribution in that direction. The official organs of trade union internationalism have actually taken quite a strong stand on climate issues, a little bit subordinate to their national governments' policies and strategies on green issues, but the global trade union organizations have had quite a good approach overall, and unions in my country have been very remiss in pretty much standing aloof from those efforts. So I think that is something to take note of. I don't think it's adequate, but I think it is an arena that we should be aware of. They present a labor and just transition perspective within the international, the COPs and the various international climate arenas. But I think there's an important role to be played by an independent voice of Labor Climate Alliance that presents a transnational approach to the issues of climate protection and how they interact with the broader economic context that we're operating in, and that's being exploited to use green so-called policies and objectives as a means of playing workers off against climate protection.
Would anyone on the panel like to respond on the question around organising amongst agricultural workers on the issue of climate justice? Luke, would you have any comment to make, or Ferron?
I think everyone should be on board. Everyone is affected. Even agricultural workers are affected. This type of solidarity must, in fact, be broad. And I think there is really a need that the leadership of the entire global movement for climate justice must be taken by the workers. If we want to really ensure that there will be just transition, if the workers will stand as a class, then I think it will be a big push towards answering that question a while ago: how do we win? Part of that is actually to have the workers stand firm on the basis of climate justice, and it should involve everyone: agricultural workers, industrial workers, mining workers. And when that happens, I think that there will be more chances for victory. And the one that I said a while ago, my answer a while ago, which is we must not forget that one of the main things that we must achieve is actually to capture political power. That can also be achieved if the workers really stand firm for climate justice, nationally in our country, and also internationally in workers creating an international solidarity network.
Thanks, Luke. And Ferron.
Yeah, thank you. I did speak to, oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. The video seems to have frozen, but the audio is fine.
Oh, okay. Okay. I was just saying that I spoke to an organizer in a farm workers union, Kasau, in the Western Cape, where they organize on the wine farms and just very, very precarious, like the most hyper exploited workers in South Africa, which is already saying a lot. And when I asked him about the organizing around climate issues and bringing workers in, I mean, his main complaint was the state of unions. So he was talking about how the trade union bureaucracy is so far away from ordinary workers, that that there's a lot of work to do inside of the union movement to reinvigorate it, and that this is sort of a secondary issue, but that it is important and something that that farm workers will be so disproportionately affected by, but it's not something immediate because we have to, do our clean our or deal with our internal issues is what he was saying. One of the main things that came across, and that's why in my contribution I was talking about how part of working with trade unions is, or bringing trade unions more closely into the climate movements or linking the movements, is about strengthening both movements, right? So it's also about how can we make sure that basics inside of trade unions are are taking place, like there's real worker democracy, that there can be campaigning unions, that we push out sort of business unionism. All of that stuff has to be part of our work too, and that's why I think it's so important that join the ranks of unions, that we and that in our work we try and strengthen. You know, if we're doing climate education, it's also shop stewards training. We strengthen our unions too, so that they can actually become more of a factor. As we see, it's becoming more and more difficult for unions to win. Yeah.
Thanks, Ferron. And I think the discussion around the agricultural sector would actually warrant a whole panel discussion of its own, because it's huge. The impact of climate on food sovereignty in itself, let alone the situation for workers and a just transition, is a huge discussion to have. Well, I think we're coming to the end of our event. I just wanted to thank our panel members again for taking the time to participate today. Ferron Pedro, Jeremy Brecher, Rika Muller-Vahl and Lucas Spiritu. We really appreciate your thoughts and analysis today. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank my co-organisers in pulling this event together, Paul LeBlanc and Jess Spear and Mehmet Uludag from the Global Eco-Socialist Network. And finally, I'd like to encourage those who are joining us today to if you're not already a member of the Global Eco-Socialist Network, please join us. It's a very affordable membership fee, one-off membership fee. We organise events like this a few times a year, but we also have general members meetings in between times, and we really are seeking to for GEN to really be a global network across all parts of the globe. So so please join us and get involved. And big thanks again to everyone who's joined us today. And as the tick has been saying, you'll be able to catch the recording of this event on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, also on Facebook. If you'd like to look back on it or look at any of the links that have been shared. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event. So thanks, everyone. Stay safe and all power to your arm in the struggle for climate justice.